the same time, we want to bring you some truly dire news. This is something we've tracked for a very long time, really since we started working together on this show, which is the opioid epidemic and how many lives it has destroyed in this country. And we've just hit a truly horrific milestone in that fight against that deadly addiction. 100,000 people died of overdoses last year. Let's go ahead and put that first element up on the screen. So this is a chart. The Washington Post did a good write-up of this. The number of people who died, this is the most in history in this country. 275 every day, people who died. It would fill the stadium where the University of Alabama plays football. There are now more overdose deaths from the illegal synthetic opioid fentanyl than there were overdose deaths from any drug in 2016. And I want to pause on that stat. This was a 28% increase from last year. So even as we've been tracking the horrors of this epidemic for years now, it jumped up 28% in 1 year. There are a few things that they cite here as potential factors, and we can talk a little bit more about this. One of the things that they said is because of the pandemic, people were more likely to be using alone. So if you get into trouble, then you don't have someone there to call 911, to administer naloxone, to help you out of that situation. You just die. So that's one of the things that is going on here. But going back to that stat about now just fentanyl deaths account for more overdose deaths than everything put together in 2016. If you guys recall back to that 2016 presidential campaign, opioid addiction was a huge part of that campaign. It was actually a huge part of how Trump started to gain traction because he talked about it.
In some of the biggest swing counties that we saw back in 2016, if you look at some correlative factors, one of the things that stuck out the most was drug overdose. The other one was actually vets killed abroad in foreign wars.
Yeah,
I always think about those two particular ones.
And job loss
Obviously job loss. That was with Bernie Sanders and with Donald Trump. The swing on amount of jobs lost to China after the WTO entrance in 2000 was like directly in line with how much votes they got, both in the primary and eventually for Trump in the general election. And I think the second part of this, which is really stark, put the map up there because it's not just that the deaths have surpassed 100,000, it's that it's very unevenly distributed. So you can actually see there, which is that West Virginia is coming in at over 90 deaths per 100,000 from a drug overdose. And
brutal.
The distribution it's very hard to pin down, right? So obviously you see the less populated states that aren't getting hit as hard, and South Dakota and all of that. But it's not one thing that's just in one particular place, even though, yes, the industrial Midwest and Appalachia get harder than everybody. You see hotspots in Florida, you see hotspot in New Mexico, even up in the high, like in the Northeast, like Maine, Vermont, Connecticut also not doing well. So yes, things are very, very bad in West Virginia and in Appalachia generally, but if you look at the whole country, the whole country is not doing so well in terms of where we see the deaths per 100,000 there on the map. West Virginia is just so, that's the real tragedy. And you have a lot of experience, so maybe you can tell us about it. Like in terms of those counties you were saying, what is it, in the South, which have particularly been hardest hit because they've lost coal jobs and they have no economic opportunity. That's where you see some of the most deaths in the country.
That's correct. I would actually like to see this map on a county by county basis because I think what you would see is even within the state of West Virginia, which has a problem overall, deaths would certainly be most concentrated. The numbers that you would see coming out of southern West Virginia, it's horrible. And it's not a surprise when you consider how exploited these people have been, how jobs, have completely disintegrated, and also just the amount of physical pain that workers are in Appalachia because they've literally use their bodies underground in very difficult jobs in order to survive. This is one of the things, a fantastic author, Beth Macy, she wrote such a great book called Dope Sick on the origins of this crisis. She's based down in southwestern Virginia around Roanoke, so right next door to West Virginia. And that whole area has been hit so incredibly hard, as has Kentucky. All of Appalachia has been hit so incredibly hard. And she really traces it back to, people who were doing hard physical labor and they had terrible chronic pain. And so you get a prescription for Oxy, and then once the doctor will no longer prescribe, well, that's actually when you really get into trouble and when you turn to the street and when you end up on heroin. And then now what we see with the rise of fentanyl, I mean, this is poison, really, in any significant quantity at all. And so, you look at these numbers, and actually there's a chart in here in this Washington Post graphic that shows Oxy prescriptions have dramatically declined.
Yes.
And as they've declined, the death rate has actually gone up.
Right, because people turn to the street.
People turn to the street. And so, look, I mean, clearly what we're doing with the war on drugs is an utter and complete failure. Most people, the overwhelming majority of these users, they don't want fentanyl. Fentanyl is so concentrated that it's easy for traffickers to smuggle. You can carry a lot more fentanyl, a lot more doses of fentanyl in a small space that weighs a lot less, and it's a lot easier to traffic and carry than an equivalent amount of heroin, and certainly than an equivalent amount of Oxy. That's what happens when you have prohibition, is people turn to the most concentrated, traffickers turn to the most concentrated form of the drug. So that's why you end up with fentanyl now across the country causing this much havoc and this much death. And by the way, one of the things that people, I think, rightly have discussed, and I think this is a part of the story, is pandemic policies and lockdowns. And as I was saying, people were then alone, and we know the way that people's mental health suffered. But we also have to acknowledge, if we put this last graphic up on the screen of how we compare to other countries, this is the US at the bottom, dramatically, I mean, not even close, higher number of deaths from overdoses from any country in the EU. They also threw in here Turkey and Norway. I mean, this is a horrific picture, and the comment here is not the sign of a healthy society at all. Well, all of these countries that we're looking at, I mean, many of them had stricter lockdown procedures in place than the United States. So to just say, oh, well, what's going on here is just a year of lockdowns, I think there's a lot more going on. It's a lot more complicated picture, because then how do you explain these countries that had much more stringent lockdowns than we did not having this same horrific toll in terms of overdose deaths?
Yeah, there's a couple of things. Number one, obviously, is the traffickers. But number two is actually we have a different type of trafficker than what Europe has to deal with. Not all those countries have legalized drugs, or even, actually, many of them even have as strict drug laws as we have. And we have Mexico, and we have China as well, in terms of supplying industrial fentanyl to Mexico, which brings up here through our porous border. It's much easier in order to get that type of quantity. But the second thing is actually the prescription. And that's where, you point to, you see the drop in subscription, but it went from 250 million to 140 million. So we still have a lot of opioid subscriptions here in the country. That's the other part of the story, which I think is really just tragic. But look, I mean, I think the real thing is that in America, we do everything a little bit bigger, a little bit worse, and we have a little bit more of a consumptive society. We also have much more disconnection from our healthcare system.
Yes.
That's a huge part of the story too, which is that, I've been doing some reading. Michael Schellenberger, who wrote this very interesting new book on San Francisco, he's very pro actually legalizing drugs. So this is why I think it's interesting from his perspective, is he points to in Portugal and in many of these other places, the amount of connection that the state has with you whenever you're going through this stuff is totally out of this world. So Portugal, for example, if you are addicted to heroin in Portugal and you're sitting on a park bench and you shoot heroin in broad daylight, you're getting arrested, even though it's illegal. But when you go to court, you're not going to go thrown to jail. They're like, you're going to mandatory, it's kind of like a paternalistic treatment where they're like, you're going to treatment, like now.
Yeah.
And I mean, you can go to jail if you want, but most people opt for treatment. And this is what I really get scared of, and this is actually inside of the Washington Post story, is the Americans suffering from substance from disorder from drugs. 18.4 million with substance use, but by age, 3.3 million are between the ages of 21 and 25. So this is actually a crisis which is skewed down on the age scale, which means, and we've seen this, when you have aging addicts and you have a system like this, it's just gonna continue to get worse. You actually see an age distribution where it's higher amongst people who are younger and then drops off as you go to the older people. Once again, I'm not saying that older people aren't addicted to the drugs in millions. I'm saying the highest percentage-wise of the age group is actually amongst people between 21 and 25. So in terms of like, if we have to revamp, the treatment option is actually gonna be one of the #1 things that we have to do. I've been looking a lot into it around how exactly Portugal, the Netherlands, and many of these other places, which do even have legalized drug systems, have much more paternalistic policies whenever it comes to, hey, like if you're addicted to drugs, like we're gonna take you off the street, you're gonna go to treatment, you have the option to go to prison if you want, but you know, most people don't want to, and there's like several interventions that happen along the way.
It's insane. You and I obviously have a disagreement about what we should do in terms of legalizing drugs, but I think we could both agree it's insane that if you have a doctor who sees this person's having trouble, they have an addiction now on this oxy prescription I'm giving them, and your solution is just I'm going to cut them off. I mean that's insane,
it's nuts.
Right? Without referring to, and then I don't want to put this like it's not just the doctor's fault here. Obviously the entire healthcare system is totally screwed, but let's say that they recommend a person to treatment. Well, is it going to get paid for by their insurance? Probably not.
No, it's not.
Do we have enough treatment or rehab beds even in the country for people? No, we don't. I mean, I used to know the stats in West Virginia, which again, hardest hit place in the entire country. The number of beds is pathetically small. So even if you refer to someone to treat, like the resources just literally are not there, which is abhorrent. And then, I think the other thing that we've talked about a lot with overdose deaths is there's a direct connection between all of these deaths of despair that we see. I mean, people are dying of cirrhosis of the liver, people who are dying of suicide, the amount of people on various prescription drugs to deal with with dramatic mental health issues, anxiety, depression. All of these things are a horrific epidemic in this country that has led to people dying younger. And for a developed country to be headed in the wrong direction in terms of mortality, the most basic failure that you could possibly have in a society. And other countries aren't, it's not like this is a developed world problem. No, other countries aren't facing this. It's us alone. So you have to look at the roots of that. I think a lot of that is a sort of disconnection, a sort of loss of any greater purpose, a sense of meaning. And, you never want to oversimplify things because every story is different of how people end up in a tragic situation. But ultimately, there's something going on society-wide that is a deep sickness and a deep rot that is leaving people totally despondent and utterly rudderless. I mean, when you think about the number of jobs that have been lost to automation, shipped overseas, the fact that we've told men that, your only worth is basically what your market worth is, and then we strip away your ability to be able to earn and provide for yourself or to be able to have a family. Yeah, that's going to leave a lot of people really devastated. So it's an incredibly grim milestone. There aren't easy solutions, although, there is a lot to learn from what other countries around the world are doing, both with regards to drugs, but also with regards to that just human connection and basic supports and connectivity with the healthcare system and all of those sorts of things.
Yeah, I completely agree. And that's the other problem, that we don't take rehab very seriously enough. The recidivism rate on heroin is something like 80% or something like that. And when you add fentanyl into that, it's even higher. And part of the reason why is a lot of our inpatient facilities are only 90 days. 90 days is not long enough in order to rewire your brain neurons. And we don't fund it. A lot of these people, you could talk to parents who've I personally know some people who've had to, go through this stuff. And 90 days is not long enough. And part of the reason why so many people OD right after they get out is because it's just, they immediately go and then they shoot up on what they used to get high on before they went into rehab. And that's immediately going to make you OD.
Yeah.
And many times, if they're alone or something, it could be too late.
If you're just going back into the exact same environment, that you left, nothing's going to be different. Nothing's going to be different.
There's so much that needs to be changed, and we could do many, many hours on this. But yeah, it's such a terrible situation. That was one of the things I most appreciated about the Andrew Yang campaign is the most basic metric of how are you doing? People living in, and how are they dying? Like, are they dying sooner? What's going on? And you see that all consistently across the board, all across the middle, parts of this country, which were completely hollowed out, like you said, economics. And I was reading an essay this weekend that just came out, Yuval Levin. It's a very, very thought-provoking essay. Maybe we'll put it in the description. And what they talk about is that the problems of the 1800s and earlier, like the social problems, were problems of people acting out in excess. And then the social problems of today are more like listness, and to the extent that they have excess, it's like excess drugs while alone. Excess drugs while participating or taking something which is sedative, which makes you like not social, which makes you, even ODing, and just the picture that we're pointing here, somebody alone by themselves. Whereas in the past, you'd be like drinking too much and going out and doing something to another person, or like social pathologies of too much action. The ones today are the opposite, and it just shows you what the problems of the 21st century with the internet, sitting on the couch, obesity, all these types of things. They're all downstream of a new consumerism and more, which we're still wrapping our heads around. I think that's what this is.
Yeah.
That's why when I say like America, like we do it, better than everybody else.
Yeah,
in some ways, like we invented it.
And the last point is a media point, which is that, last time I talked to Bernie, he was pointing out, which I didn't even know because it got zero media coverage. They did an entire hearing on decline in mortality rates. Why? Where? New numbers, which demographics has it hit, which places in the country, what's going on here. Really important. I mean, the most important thing you could possibly talk about, zero media interest. Yeah. Zero media interest. They would rather talk about, whatever the stupid culture war outrage of Steve Bannon or like Big Bird or whatever insanity is going on that day. They would rather talk about than, the things that are most impactful to your lives.
Sesame Street should actually unironically do an opioid thing. That actually would probably be better off for the country. But
full support of that.
There you go.
Hey guys, thanks so much for watching.
That's right. Just as a reminder, you can become a premium subscriber today. Watch the full show completely uncut, our reactions to each other's monologues. You get to listen to it. You get to ask us questions, all that good stuff. Link is right there in the description or at breakingpoints.com.
Best of all, great way to say screw you to the mainstream media.